Fellas, I'm going to be going through UFC fighters with zero non-weaknesses, and I'm not just going to be going through the pound-for-pound list of the best fighters and reading them all off. I will try and include some unranked fighters as well to make it fair. We're going to be going through some UFC fighters with zero non-weaknesses, the fighters that you can't point anywhere in their game and say that this can be capitalized on. And we'll start off with the first fighter, and I've just got to get it out of the way. Islam Makhachev. I mean, when I think of a fighter that's unbeatable and has pretty much zero weaknesses, Islam Makhachev is the fighter that comes to mind. I mean, he's literally pound-for-pound #1 in the world. He's the lightweight champion, and it doesn't look like that lightweight belt is going to be going anywhere soon. And he's already got a really good resume, beating Charles Oliveira, who was dominating the lightweight division, beating pound-for-pound #1 at the time, Alexander Volkanovski twice, Dustin Poirier as well, and a couple other lightweights. He's actually got a really good resume, and we'll break Islam Makhachev down martial art by martial art to see how well-rounded he is and see how he does in different areas of martial arts. And we'll start off with wrestling. Wrestling is the bread and butter of Islam Makhachev. This is where he does the best. I mean, in that Charles Oliveira fight, everyone was saying that, you know, Makhachev's going to be too scared to wrestle with Oliveira because of the jiu-jitsu threat. He made him look like a complete... He made Oliveira look like an amateur when it came to grappling, the way that he was dominating with wrestling. That fight with Dustin Poirier did really well to out-wrestle him in the majority of the fight as well. The Volkanovski fight, don't get me wrong, Volkanovski showed great takedown defense, but in that first fight with Volkanovski, his wrestling was on display. Even in just all of his fights, Makhachev is known for having really good wrestling. Some people might even go as far to say he's the best wrestler in the UFC right now, and it's hard to argue as well. He's been able to out-wrestle every single opponent that he's ever gone against in the UFC so far. His wrestling seems to be so dominant, and people talk about him as a striker nowadays, as if he's kind of transitioned to a striker, when in reality, he's still a wrestler. His wrestling is just that good. He doesn't need to force it off the get-go because he knows that he's got it in the back pocket, so he's definitely going to get a tick for wrestling. Now, his striking, is he just a one-dimensional wrestler? Can he actually strike? Well, I think he can. I mean, he was outboxing Dustin Poirier at times. I understand he's got the threat of the takedown, but if his striking's effective, it's effective at the end of the day. Knocked out Alexander Volkanovski. You can say that it was on short notice and whatever, but it was still short notice for Islam Makhachev as well. He was preparing for Oliveira, so he still knocked out Alexander Volkanovski. Dropped Oliveira multiple times when there for. Oliveira, you know, he was hyped up as having this really good Muay Thai, and you know, Islam Makhachev was dropping him multiple times in that fight leading up to the finish, and he's just known for having pretty good striking as Makhachev. People are now including him in their top 10 list of best strikers in the UFC because of how effective his striking has become. And his submission game, well, I'd argue that he's probably got best submissions out of everything else in his game. I mean, submitted one of the best submission artists in the UFC in Charles Oliveira, made Poirier tap and sleep in the same fight, submitted Dan Hooker a few years ago, and Dan Hooker's now a top 5 lightweight, and he's just always had such a good submission game as Islam Makhachev. When he takes people down, he will either absolutely beat you to the pulp like he did with Bobby Green with ground and pound, and if not, he's going to find a submission, and there's nothing you can do about it. So all of, you know, his areas of martial arts can be ticked. On top of that, he's very durable, and he showed that in his fight with Alexander Volkanovski when he went 5 rounds. He showed that in his fight with Dustin Poirier when he went 5 rounds and finished him in the 5th. He even showed that in his fight with Thiago Moises that not a lot of people talk about, where he went 4 rounds against Moises. Now, potential weaknesses that I could possibly bring up about Islam Makhachev, if I had to kind of think of any potential weakness, you can say that he kind of tends to perform worse in dogfights. I'm not saying he does terrible in dogfights, but when he gets into a 5-fighter scrap, that's when we kind of see Makhachev become a little bit more, not exposed, but a little bit more kind of vulnerable. I mean, you look at the fight with Alexander Volkanovski. Volkanovski nearly finished him in that 5th round after he'd had an absolute war with Alexander Volkanovski. You could even argue the Poirier fight. Poirier was supposed to be this easy contender for Islam Makhachev, and Poirier really made Makhachev work, and he made it into a dogfight. Still got finished, but he made it into a dogfight. And the next weakness is he doesn't have Khabib-level dominance with wrestling, but I'd argue that that doesn't really matter. Just because you don't have the same dominance as one of the most dominant wrestlers in UFC history, I'm not really seeing that as a big weakness. Is he as dominant as Khabib with wrestling? He isn't. But, you know, can you really blame him when Khabib's one of the most dominant wrestlers in the UFC history? I don't think you can. Now, if we look at the lightweight rankings and cross off everyone he's fought already, and I know he's fought Arman Tsarukyan as well, but we'll get onto him in a second. And we talk about some potential matchups who he could possibly face. I mean, like, I'll go to Arman Tsarukyan, who's probably going to be next. I think he beats Arman Tsarukyan comfortably. Tsarukyan is such a good... I think he's always going to... Well, not always, but I think he's going to be the top #1 lightweight for a while, but I still think Makhachev beats him. Michael Chandler's stylistically a problem, but I still think he gets through Chandler. Justin Gaethje, he ain't going to be getting a title shot anytime soon, and even if he does, he'll get folded just like he did with Khabib. So I think it's safe to say that Makhachev is one of the few fighters in the UFC where we really have to dig deep to even find any form of weakness for Islam Makhachev. And we'll get on to the next fighter, which is Tom Aspinall, most people's heavyweight champion of the world. I mean, the dude's pound for pound number 8. I believe he's the only guy in the pound for pound list right now that has never won an undisputed belt. He's the current interim heavyweight champion, what most people would call him the heavyweight champion, and he has done more clearing out of the heavyweight division than anyone has for years. This dude has nearly cleared out the top 10 of the heavyweight division, and we'll get into his martial arts just like we did with Makhachev. Wrestling, Aspinall's got really good wrestling. I mean, he said it when people talk about his fight with Alex Pereira. He said he's going to rugby tackle Alex Pereira to the ground, and I completely agree. He showed it in the Alexander Volkov fight a few years ago, how dominant his wrestling is. Whenever he decides to go for a takedown, he usually gets it. I think he's got a 100% takedown rate as well. He's always had really good wrestling as Aspinall. Whenever he wants to use it, he seems like he just uses it flawlessly, and we've been seeing a lot more of his striking recently, but don't get confused. This dude can still wrestle. He ain't one-dimensional. He ain't not Alexander Volkov. If this dude wants to take it to the ground, he can do that. He's striking, I don't really need to explain his striking. Knocked out Curtis Blades in the first round, knocked out Sergey Pavlovich, the big scary Russian, in the first round, knocked out Marcin Tybura in the first round, knocked out Sergey Spivak in the first round. This dude is the best, or at least one of the best strikers in the heavyweight division. I know you can bring up Cyril Gane and people like that, but he's got some of the best striking in the heavyweight division. His submission game, he comes from a jiu-jitsu background. He's been training jiu-jitsu his entire life. I think his dad was one of the first Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belts in the UK. He's always been a Brazilian jiu-jitsu nerd, as Tom Aspinall. Submitted Alexander Volkov a few years ago. That fight with Andrei Arlovski where he just took him down and found the submission within seconds. He has a complete base of martial art, and like I said, on top of that, he's got so many other things that make up for it as well. Not make up for it, but things he can add on top of that as well. The dude's got the shortest average fight time in the UFC right now. The shortest time on bottom position as well. The striking differential record as well. He's holding multiple records right now in the UFC without ever fighting for an undisputed belt. Now, the potential weaknesses that you can draw from Tom Aspinall is he leaves his chin up in the air. It's something I've been worried about watching Aspinall. He nearly got knocked out from Sergey Pavlovich from this. He does leave his chin up quite wide in the air. Even in the Arlovski fight a few years ago, the only fighter to make it out of the first round with Tom Aspinall, he does leave his chin up in the air, and it kind of makes me worry if he's going to face one of these powerful strikers if he does get chinned. And the second weakness is the gas tank and durability are unknown. I can't really say it's a weakness because we don't know if it's a weakness or not, but every single one of his fights, apart from the fight with Arlovski, which ended 1 minute into the second round, hasn't made it past the first round in the UFC, so we don't know how good Aspinall's stamina is. For all we know, it could be terrible when you get into the second or the third round. We still have to see that, but so far, he doesn't really show many potential weaknesses. Now, if we go back to the heavyweight division, I mean, he's cleared most of them out, and if we just go through a few names who he hasn't fought, I mean, Cyril Gane, great striker, but I think Aspinall takes him down. Alex Pereira, listen, I love Pereira. I love the run that he's on right now. I think he's pound for pound definitely top 2, but Aspinall would rugby tackle him to the floor and find the submission within seconds, with all due respect to Pereira. John Jones, this one's a very controversial one because no one really knows who to side with, because you've got the GOAT versus the best, but Jones ain't fighting him, so we're never going to know. Gelton Almeida, great grappler, but I think Aspinall lights him up on the feet, so I think it's safe to say that in the heavyweight division, Tom Aspinall has everything going for him. He's completely well-rounded. He looks to be better than all the other heavyweights right now. And he just seems to be in an absolute roll. So I think Tom Aspinall's another fighter that seems to be unbeatable. And then we're going to go with Gene Silva. I did say I am going to include a few unranked fighters, and I feel like why not include Gene Silva on this list? I mean, he hasn't got all these flashy belts and all these pound-for-pound rankings or anything like that, but he's 4-0 in the UFC right now with 3 finishes. He knocked out Charles Jourdain 2 fights ago, and then just 2 weeks after that, goes out there and beats Drew Dober in a completely different division on short notice as well. Now, the wrestling of Gene Silva, it's pretty much untested, but I think he's got really good takedown defense. He showed in that fight with Drew Dober, and Drew Dober's a pretty solid wrestler that he's got good takedown defense. Drew Dober really struggled taking him to the mat, and I think the takedown defense is all we really needed to see from Gene Silva. Even in that fight with Charles Jourdain was trying to take him down, and Gene Silva had no problem keeping it on the feet, so I think we can take his wrestling. Maybe he's not an extremely good offensive wrestler, but defensively he's shown to be pretty good. His striking, dude, he's one of the best unranked strikers in the featherweight division. I'd argue he's one of the best strikers in the featherweight division, whether he's ranked or not. He looks so crafty against Drew Dober. Those spinning elbows, those spinning attacks. That Fighting Nerds gym is producing some killers. This dude has such good striking. Knocked out Charles Jourdain within a couple of rounds as well. Knocked out Weston Wilson. He's powerful, he's dangerous, but most importantly, he's so crafty. So he's definitely getting the striking column as well. Now, for submissions, I'm going to give him a question mark. We don't really know how good his submission game is, because we don't really know how good his submission game is. But what else does he have to make up for it? I mean, the dude is, like I said before, crafty as nails, and he's just so... He's just built for dogfights. Like, we talk about Makhachev maybe not being the best when it comes to dogfights. Gene Silva's the opposite. He thrives in dogfights. Now, some potential weaknesses that you can draw from Gene Silva. He is quite hittable. Drew Dober was able to tag Gene Silver quite a few times, and he does seem to be quite hittable, does Gene Silver, so I'm going to say that's his first potential weakness. And the next one, he's yet to fight a top featherweight or lightweight. It's all good beating the likes of Drew Dober and Charles Jourdain and Weston Wilson, but when the best fighter you've beaten is Drew Dober, I want to see how he does against a ranked featherweight or a ranked lightweight, whatever division he wants to stay at. And if we do look at the featherweight rankings and the potential matchups for him, Edson Barboza, I think he batters Edson Barboza at this stage in Barboza's career. Kika Chikadze, I think that's a really fun fight. Bryce Mitchell, he'd send Bryce Mitchell straight back into a coma like Josh Emmett did. So, Gene Silver, I said I'm going to include an unranked fighter. That's the unranked fighter I'm going to include. And I think he doesn't really have any obvious weaknesses right now. He seems to be in an absolute role, seems to be super well-rounded. So, I'm going to include Gene Silver. Back to the champions, the next pay-per-view headliner, Ilia Topuria. I think Ilia Topuria is one of the better, one of the more fighters in the UFC right now that don't really have any weaknesses. I mean, the dude is the featherweight champion of the world. He's in the top 4 pound-for-pound list, and he just knocked out Alexander Volkanovski, the first guy to beat Volkanovski in the featherweight division, and he's undefeated at 15-0 as well. Ilia Topuria seems to have everything going for him right now. The wrestling of Topuria, he has the wrestling. He showed it in that Josh Emmett fight later in those rounds, and he was able to pretty much easily take Josh Emmett down and batter him with ground and pound like it was absolutely nothing. Even in that Bryce Mitchell fight, Mitchell's hyped up as this up-and-coming wrestler, and Topuria just ragdolls him, making him look like a complete amateur. The fight with Jai Herbert, people think he's just a born striker. This dude came from a grappling background in Ilia Topuria, and his wrestling's definitely there. In fact, that's what I think he has over Max Holloway. He has the wrestling over Max Holloway. Max Holloway's never really displayed good wrestling. Topuria's got the wrestling in his back pocket. Now, the striking doesn't really need talking about. Knocked out Alexander Volkanovski. Not only that, didn't he only beat Volkanovski in the featherweight division, but also knocked him out as well, which is impressive. Completely just butchered Bryce Mitchell on the feet in that Josh Emmett fight. He just completely bullied Josh Emmett in that fight for 5 rounds straight. One of the most dominant performances of 2023 when he just completely battered Josh Emmett. Josh Emmett, this dangerous boxer, and Topuria just makes him look terrible. And not terrible, but Topuria just bullies him around on the feet. He's got the striking as well. Submission game, he's got really good submissions as well. He actually comes from a submission background. He submitted the big grappling prospect in Bryce Mitchell. In fact, he's got more submissions on his name than he does knockouts. 5 knockouts to his name, and he's got 8 submissions as well. So I think all the martial arts are ticked for Ilia Topuria. On top of that, like I said, he beat Alexander Volkanovski, who was one of the best pound for pound, who was the featherweight champion at the time. That's the guy who he beat. And he's got a pretty good chin on him as well. I mean, he survived 5 rounds of Josh Emmett. He survived that lethal head kick from Jai Herbert. He seems like he's got a pretty good chin on him as well. So he's looking pretty good in the featherweight division is Topuria. Now, the potential weaknesses that you can kind of draw for Topuria, I can't think of any. I really can't think of any weaknesses for Ilia Topuria. Honestly, his stamina seems to be there. He seems to be well-rounded. He's not really got any lacking attributes. I honestly think that Topuria has no potential weaknesses that I could even draw. Now, if we look at the featherweight division and potential matchups for him, I've crossed out the fighters who he's already fought. Obviously, Max Holloway, I think this is a complete 50-50 fight, but if I'm being completely honest, I am leaning towards Topuria. I do think it's fairly 50-50, but if I had to pick one, I'd probably lean towards Topuria. Diego Lopez, again, another very, very close fight because Diego Lopez is on an absolute roll. And if there's anyone that's going to beat Topuria, I can definitely see Lopez being that guy, but still, you can't really pick Lopez over Topuria at this moment in time. And the winner of Evlo Evans Sterling, I think they get absolutely battered by Ilia Topuria, to be fair. So Topuria, I literally can't think of any weaknesses to this dude. He's one of the best champions in the UFC right now, pound for pound top 5, and I just can't really think of any weaknesses. Next, what we've got, Umar Nurmagomedov. Now, Umar Nurmagomedov, he's undefeated at 18-0, and he's just got a massive win over Corey Sandhagen, and he's the next contender for the bantamweight belt. Now, the wrestling of Umar Nurmagomedov, it's his bread and butter. This dude, I mean, out-wrestled Corey Sandhagen, and Corey Sandhagen's known for having good wrestling as he displayed in his previous 2 fights, and Umar Nurmagomedov just went out there and put a really good wrestling display did Umar Nurmagomedov. It's not even just the Sandhagen fight. The fight before that with Beksat, he completely dominated Beksat for 3 rounds straight with just wrestling. And even before that, his entire UFC career, he's just dominated everyone in the UFC so far with wrestling. Nobody has been able to survive the wrestling of Umar Nurmagomedov. Whether you're giving him a can, whether you're giving him Sandhagen, no matter who it is, no one's really been able to get overcome the wrestling of Umar Nurmagomedov. So I'm going to take the wrestling. The striking, he's got that too. In fact, I think he's got underrated striking. There were times when he was not walking down, but when he was out striking Sandhagen for moments in their fight, and Sandhagen's meant to be one of the craftiest, most well-rounded dudes in the bantamweight division. He was landing on Sandhagen, he was outboxing him at times, and he seemed like his striking had been really sharp in that fight. He's had brutal knockouts in his UFC career so far, and I think he's one of the most underrated strikers as well. A lot of grapplers, because their grappling is so good, people kind of just assume that their striking is bad. Umar Nurmagomedov, I wouldn't even mind him on the feet against some of these top bantamweight contenders. I think he's got the striking in the bag as well, And his submission game, he's got good submission games. Submitted Brian Kelleher. He's had multiple submissions in his MMA career so far, a few in his UFC career, and he's just an absolute machine. Similar to Islam Makhachev, when he takes you to the floor, you're either going to get absolutely dominated by ground and pound, or he's going to pick up a submission with it, within a couple of minutes as well. So he's got all those stuff. I actually think he beats Merab. I think even though Merab's one of the best in the world, I think Nurmagomedov beats him, and I think he becomes a champion as well on that same night. So that's what Nurmagomedov's got going for him. Now, the potential weaknesses that maybe Umar Nurmagomedov has is that he is somewhat hittable. 2 fights ago, he got dropped by Bekzat Almakhan. Bekzat was this debuting in the UFC, and he was able to drop Umar Nurmagomedov. Even Sandhagen was landing. I say even Sandhagen as if that's shameful, but Sandhagen was able to land on him a few times, so he is somewhat hittable, and he has only fought one good bantamweight. Don't get me wrong, a win over Corey Sandhagen is a massive win. I mean, it's a win that can guarantee you a title shot, but that's all he's really got on his resume so far. We're yet to see him against different styles, different bantamweights, so we need to see how he does against different bantamweights. Now, if we look at the rankings in the bantamweight division of who he could possibly fight, we'll cross out Corey Sandhagen because he's already fought him. Sean O'Malley, I think he beats Sean O'Malley, especially after that performance that he put against Merab. I think Umar Nurmagomedov beats O'Malley easier than Merab did. The winner of Yana Figueiredo, I think the winner of Yana Figueiredo would have earned a title shot, but I think it doesn't matter. I think Nurmagomedov beats them both. And Merab, like I said before, I think he beats Merab. He's got much better striking than Merab, and I think his wrestling is so much more dominant than Merab. I know it's kind of Merab's style, but when Merab takes people down, they tend to get up within a few minutes, whereas when Nurmagomedov takes you down, it's very rare that you get back up in that same round unless your name's Corey Sandhagen. So Umar Nurmagomedov, not yet a champion, only had one good win in the UFC, but I must say he does look like he has very few weaknesses, and he seems to tick all the boxes in the UFC. And the final fighter that I've gone for is another unranked fighter who trains at Fighting Nerds, Mauricio Hufe. Mauricio Hufe is one of the best lightweight prospects right now. He's got a ton of hype to his name. 2 fights in the UFC, or 1 fight in the UFC in the Contender Series win, both ending in knockouts. Every single one of his wins has ended in a KO or TKO as well. Now, the wrestling of Hufe, he's shown that he's got really good wrestling. That takedown at the end that he landed in that first round against Jimmy Malarkey was super impressive. I just thought he was one of these one-dimensional strikers, and he whips out that in the first round against Malarkey, which was super impressive. The Contender Series was able to get dominant position in the grappling exchange and just batter his opponent with ground and pound. And even his takedown defense in that fight, in the Contender Series, he had really good takedown defense too. So I think we can give his wrestling a question mark. It's kind of, we can't really say he's got good wrestling at this moment in time because he hasn't really displayed it against any good wrestlers. But at the same time, I can't say it's bad because he hasn't been absolutely dominated with wrestling. He hasn't shown wrestling weaknesses. Striking, I mean, I said it before, this dude's won every single one of his fights by KO or TKO. He's one of the craftiest strikers in the lightweight division. That fight against Jimmy Malarkey, people were comparing him to the early days of Conor McGregor, and I don't blame them. This dude is so crafty with everything that he throws. He's got like a unique, he's just everything about this dude. You need to watch that fight with Jimmy Malarkey. Just completely bullied Malarkey on the feet. The timing was perfect. Everything he threw was at perfect position. And even in the Contender Series, like I said, his gas tank, he was able to make it to 3 rounds, and he just completely battered his opponent with striking as well. He is such a good striker, and I can't wait to see him because of how crafty he is on the feet. In his submission game, again, he's never got a submission win in his UFC career. He's also never, or his MMA career, he's also never lost by submission. So I'm going to put a question mark on the submission as well. Now, potential weaknesses is that his grappling is unknown. Like I said before, it's all good battering these people on the feet and looking amazing on the feet, but we're still yet to see him face an actual good grappler. But I can't wait to see him in his next fight. He's matched up against Charlie Campbell for UFC 309, and I just can't wait to see him fight. I think he was scheduled to fight on 307. It fell through. But no, Mauricio Hufe, I can't wait to see him fight. Lightweight prospect, seems to tick all the boxes in MMA, and I think he's another one of these fighters, same from the Fighting Nerds like Gene Silver, that seems to be unstoppable in the UFC right now. But those are some of the fighters in the UFC that I think have zero non-weaknesses. Fighters that you can't point out any area of their game and say that they're lacking because they are just so well-rounded. So let me know your thoughts on this list and if you agree, and thank you for watching.